Have you ever noticed how a single scroll through your social media feed can feel like walking through a minefield of health advice? One minute, you're being told that carbs are the enemy of longevity, and the next, someone is selling you a miracle supplement that promises to fix your metabolism in 48 hours. It's exhausting, frankly. It feels like we've traded deep understanding for quick fix headlines, and in the process, we've lost sight of what the science actually says.
It's the magic pill syndrome. Everyone wants the shortcut, but nobody wants to talk about the biological toll or the actual data behind the claims. It's why people are so confused. You've got these loud voices screaming about biohacking your way to immortality, but they skip over the basic mechanisms of how the body actually functions. I think that's why we're seeing a shift toward what I like to call clinical realism. Getting back to the messy, complicated, but ultimately more rewarding truth of human biology.
Exactly. Clinical realism isn't about giving people a list of do's and don'ts. It's about explaining the why. If we look at the way top-tier scientific communication is evolving, it's moving away from the hack and toward the mechanism. Think about the way we discuss metabolic health. It's not just about eating less and moving more. It's about understanding the signaling pathways, the hormonal responses, and the cellular stress that dictates how we store energy. When you understand the mechanism, you don't need a guru to tell you what to do. The logic becomes self-evident.
Right, but let's be honest. If you just sit there and lecture people on mTOR pathways and mitochondrial density for an hour, most people are going to tune out by the 5-minute mark. There's a balance to strike. You need that deep dive data, sure, but you also need to make it relatable. I always think about how we handle cultural diets. If someone grows up in a culture where rice is the literal foundation of every meal, telling them to just go keto isn't just bad advice. It's culturally tone-deaf and practically impossible. You have to find the humor in the struggle and the reality in the science.
That's a fair point. Relatability is the bridge between the lab and the living room. But the danger is when relatability slides into oversimplification. We see this a lot with the current discourse around GLP-1 medications. There's so much fear-based messaging, on one side calling them cheating, and then on the other side, you have people acting like they're a risk-free miracle for everyone. A pragmatic approach would be to admit the uncertainty. We have to be willing to say, the data shows incredible efficacy for weight loss, but we are still learning about the long-term trade-offs regarding muscle mass or gastrointestinal signaling.
And that honesty is so rare. It's much easier to sell a miracle or a disaster than it is to sell a nuanced trade-off. It's like the supplement industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar machine built almost entirely on the idea that you're missing one specific secret ingredient. I love getting into the weeds of myth-busting there. When you see a claim that a specific green powder is going to reset your gut microbiome overnight, you have to be assertive. You have to call it out as marketing, not medicine.
It requires a certain level of intellectual aggression, doesn't it? To stand up and say, no, that anti-carb messaging is actually based on a misinterpretation of this specific study. But that's where the authority comes from. If we aren't willing to debunk the fake claims, we're essentially leaving the audience to fend for themselves in a sea of misinformation. The myth-busting element isn't just for entertainment. It's a necessary filter for the public.
It also builds trust. If I tell you that a popular, fat-burning supplement is essentially just expensive caffeine and a placebo, you might be annoyed that you spent the money, but you'll trust me when I tell you something that actually does work later on. It's about being a reliable filter. But I want to go back to what you said about mechanisms. How do we explain something as complex as insulin resistance without making it sound like a graduate-level biochemistry lecture?
You use metaphors that stick. Think of your cells like a busy restaurant. Insulin is the host, trying to seat the customers, which is the glucose. In a healthy system, the host opens the door, the customers sit down, and everything flows. But in insulin resistance, the restaurant is already packed. The host is screaming, banging on the door, but there's no room left. Eventually, the host just gives up. When people visualize that, they stop thinking about bad foods and start thinking about capacity and signaling. It changes the relationship from one of guilt to one of management.
I love that. It takes the shame out of it. And that's a huge part of the clinical realism we're talking about. We have to move away from the willpower narrative. Willpower is a finite resource. Biology is a constant state. If we're talking about sustainable lifestyle integration, we have to acknowledge that people have jobs, kids, and stress. We can't expect everyone to live like a professional athlete or a lab rat.
Which brings us to the concept of trade-offs. Every intervention has a cost. If you go on an extreme caloric deficit, you might lose weight. But what happens to your bone density? What happens to your resting metabolic rate? A truly scientific approach doesn't just look at the primary outcome. It looks at the systemic ripples. We have to be comfortable with the "it depends" answer. It's not as satisfying as a yes or no, but it's the only honest answer in biology.
It depends is the least popular phrase in marketing and the most important phrase in science. It's funny, the more I look at the data, the more I realize that the boring stuff is what actually moves the needle. Sleep, consistent protein intake, resistance training, and fiber. But you can't really hype fiber the same way you can hype a new peptide or a high-tech wearable.
True, but you can make the science of fiber fascinating if you talk about the short-chain fatty acids and the way they communicate with your brain to regulate mood. There's a deep, almost philosophical beauty in how interconnected these systems are. We aren't just a collection of organs. We're a massive, chemical conversation that never stops. When you start to see yourself that way, you realize that hacking the system is a bit like trying to rewrite a symphony by changing one note. It's more about conducting the orchestra.
That's a great way to put it. Conducting, not hacking. It implies a level of respect for the body's natural complexity. I think that's where the Attila Huberman style of communication really wins. It respects the listener's intelligence. It assumes they want to understand the symphony, not just hear the highlights. But we also have to be careful not to fall into the trap of analysis paralysis, where we're so busy studying the data that we never actually take a walk or eat a vegetable.
The evidence-based trap. I've seen people refuse to try a basic health intervention because there hasn't been a 20-year, double-blind, peer-reviewed study on that specific variation. At some point, pragmatism has to take over. We use the best available data we have today, while openly admitting it might change tomorrow. That's the scientific method in action. It's a process of being less wrong over time, not being perfectly right from day one.
And that's the ultimate takeaway, isn't it? The world of health and wellness is always going to be a bit of a circus, but if you have a solid understanding of the core mechanisms and a healthy dose of skepticism for anything that sounds too good to be true, you're already ahead of 90% of the population. You don't need to be a doctor to think like a scientist.
Exactly. It's about developing that internal compass. When someone tells you that a specific fruit is a fat-burning miracle, your brain should immediately go to, what's the mechanism? Where is the metabolic pathway for that? Does this hold up against what we know about thermodynamics? Usually, the answer is a resounding no, but the process of asking the question is what protects you from the hype.
And it makes the journey more interesting. Instead of being a victim of the latest trend, you become an investigator of your own health. You start to see the patterns. You see how your sleep affects your cravings the next day, not as a failure of character, but as a biological consequence of ghrelin and leptin shifts. It's empowering.
It really is. As we wrap up today, I want to leave the listeners with a thought. We live in an era where information is infinite, but wisdom is scarce. The next time you encounter a bold health claim, don't just look at the what, the result they're promising. Look for the how. If they can't explain the mechanism without using buzzwords or vague promises, it's probably not science, it's sales.
Well said. And remember, the most effective hack in existence is still just consistency. It's not flashy, it's not expensive, and you can't buy it in a bottle, but the data on that is pretty much settled. We're going to keep digging into these mechanisms, debunking the nonsense, and trying to find that middle ground where clinical realism meets everyday life.
Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't just to live longer, it's to live better, with a clear understanding of the incredible biological machine we've been given. There's a lot more to uncover, and the science is moving faster than ever. We just have to make sure we're moving with it, eyes wide open, and skeptical of the shortcuts.
Here's to being less wrong tomorrow than we are today. Thanks for joining the conversation. We'll be back next time to dive even deeper into the data that actually matters. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning the noise.